it's Two Geek Soup. We are back with an episode about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. And back with me is Jeff Mitchell.
Hi, guys.
Yay! And girls. Probably there are girls.
I've heard.
Yeah, well, anyway. Hopefully there are also girls. I'd like to think so. Yeah. Anyway, Guardians 2. So, in terms of, I know we like to kind of kick this off with talking about the comics a little bit. Like, there are so many, like, OG Guardians references in this movie. And, like, and so many of the older, of, like, the original Guardians team is introduced in this movie. Like, in just cameos or little, or one of the, like, 18 mid-credit scenes.
Yeah, so that's actually, I was going to ask you some questions about this.
Great, let's do it.
Because, so I think the thing I'm most curious about is the Ravagers, because I don't know anything. This is why I love talking to you after watching these movies, because I know almost nothing about the comic universe, right? And I know they pull on a lot of stuff. So the Ravagers specifically, like what's kind of like the backstory there, and what was the deal with at the end of the movie, the guy that Stallone plays sort of has a team of people there.
Yeah.
And I had no idea who they were, but I was like, obviously there's some people from the comics that were some kind of team. So
let's start off with the team that he has, that Stallone has at the end. So in the movie, you hear him referred to as Stakar.
That's the name I couldn't remember.
The name, because it's really forgettable and sort of weird.
Yeah.
But that is half of a name, Stakar Ogord, and maybe you remember him referring to the lights of Ogord. And Stakar Ogord is the real name of one of the original Guardians of the Galaxy named Starhawk. Okay. And if you're really interested in Starhawk, you just need to look that up on Wikipedia, because that is some really, really wild nonsense that I just can't possibly start to get into. If you think about how Merlin from Arthurian legend, sometimes depending on which version of the story is being told, that he ages backwards through time.
Uh-huh.
It's kind of like that, except more confusing.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really weird.
Also like Benjamin Button?
Not
really?
No, not really.
Okay.
Yeah. So, so that whole team that he has is mostly the original Guardians of the Galaxy. The crystalline guy is Martin X. And I think I mentioned in the episode I did with Daniel about Guardians Volume 1 that the original Guardians of the Galaxy was a completely separate team in a future timeline. And that they were most of them, except for that version of Yondu, were actually genetically altered humans that had been engineered to survive on the different planets of the solar system.
Interesting.
So the crystalline guy, Martin X, is from Pluto, and because of the extremes of temperature there, they've engineered the Plutovians to regulate their temperature, and so he can manipulate cold and heat.
Oh, okay. Too bad he's just on an asteroid now and not a planet.
Yeah, poor
Be him.
Poor Martin X, you've got no home planet anymore. And so then, so that's the crystal guy. The big burly guy is Charlie 27, and I think that those big, stocky, strong folks were from, I want to say, Saturn? I'm not sure why that makes sense, because gas planet, but whatever. There was, let's see, I think the other person who was on that team is Alita, and her story is involved with Starhawks, and that's part of the whole confusion nonsense. And and then the head that talks is Mainframe, who is actually sort of a technological descendant of Stark Tech.
Okay.
Yeah. And then another part of the original Guardians team was Yondu, and in the comics he was actually from Alpha Centauri. And not a Ravager. And in fact, the Ravagers are, as far as I can tell, a creation of the MCU.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ravagers are just MCU space pirates, essentially.
Interesting. Yeah. And the other one I had a question about, I do want to talk about Yondu because he's one of my favorite characters after Guardians 2.
Yeah, well, we're going to have to get into Yondu because he's super, super central to the whole point and theme of this movie.
Right, yeah. So the other question I had is, like, what's the backstory on the Sovereign? Because they're really interesting, but, like, we don't really know anything about them from the movie other than them being like a race of douchebags.
Right. Yes. So in the comics, the Sovereign also exist. They're a little bit different, of course, because the MCU just kind of like takes elements and then alters them to suit the narrative of whatever film they're making. But
right.
the main sort of aspect of the Sovereign that is most prominently like plucked from the comics lore is the High Priestess Aisha, who I like to call the Priestess of Exposition, because that's all she does. Is she sits there and tells you things that maybe are kind of interesting, but you don't really even need to know.
Yeah.
And in the comics, she's a little bit more interesting and important because she is a sort of a genetically engineered sort of like perfect being, that was sort of built from the ground up to be like the exemplar of life, essentially. And was originally called just She.
Oh, interesting.
And she's, taken on a couple of other names. She was called Kismet for a while, and then was more, going by Aisha mainly. But what makes that an interesting connection is that she had a counterpart called, any guesses?
He?
Ding, ding, ding. He was called He initially, and later came to be called Adam Warlock.
Yeah, Adam Warlock, which is who they allude to at the end, one of the post-credit scenes. Except in the MCU, she created him.
That's right, yeah. And in the comics, she was just sort of his female counterpart.
Yeah.
And
it's kind of cool, though, that they had her create him. Like, the Sovereign sort of imagine that they're kind of, like, above everybody else.
Right.
And she created something that she called Adam.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting that they kind of like sort of fancy themselves as deities, and then she makes something that she calls Adam.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's definitely some things there that we can probably mine. But obviously the sort of the main story of this movie. I'm sorry. Did you have anything else that you wanted to bring up before we start kind of digging into the plot here?
As far as my like general thoughts on the movie, I actually liked the movie a lot more the second time that I saw it than the first. I mean, the first time I really liked it, and there were some things the second time that I was like the opening scene. Actually, the second time I saw that, I liked it more than the first time because it was funny. But I was thinking, man, they're really just kind of overdoing this. This whole, like, things going on in the background humor. Mm-hmm. And I really hope they don't just focus on Baby Groot the whole movie.
Something interesting about Baby Groot, and specifically his voice, is that Vin Diesel performed that voice without any sort of digital alteration whatsoever.
Oh, that is cool.
Yeah,
I
and
love
furthermore,
like that. Yeah.
he performed the voice dub for that part in 16 languages in Guardians 2.
Whoa. That's crazy.
Yeah,
Of
I mean,
course, all he really needed to say was "I am Groot" in
right.
16 languages, but
But to be able to
different inflection.
convincingly perform, like the correct pronunciation in 16 different languages, I think is
Yeah.
fairly impressive.
Yeah.
In the first movie, he only did it in 6 languages. Only 6.
Only 6.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I like the opening scene a lot better, and actually, like, I enjoyed Baby Groot a lot more in this one. One of the cool things I noticed the second time I watched it was like they actually did a really good job of sort of capturing the essence of a child in
Yeah.
Baby Groot. You know, like
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of specific examples, but just like easily distracted, and yeah.
Yeah, there was definitely sort of a sense of wonder about a lot of what he was doing.
Yeah. So I guess the second time I sort of got over my whole like, oh, they put a cute baby in it and everyone's gonna love it now, Like,
Yeah. There are some interesting aspects to that character that you don't really necessarily know, though, going in, is that this is not actually the same Groot. Like, it's basically an offspring that continues to have his memories, but is in fact a distinct and separate, different being.
I think I knew that. I can't remember how much they showed at the end of Guardians 1, but I thought it was like they clipped a sapling off of him or something.
It was basically just one of the little twigs that was left after Groot's safety ball blew up.
Yeah, it was basically like you would graft. You would like take a cutting from a plant and like start a new plant.
Yeah. Yeah. So essentially it's almost exactly like that.
So yeah, and the other thing was like at the beginning of the movie, I started to feel like the humor and the characters seemed a little forced compared to what I remember from Guardians 1. But by the end, like once you get into it, once you get into the story, like the depth of the characters is really good in this movie. I mean,
yeah. Now, so one thing that is interesting to me about this movie and where it fits in the timeline that, again, you wouldn't necessarily know unless you had, really gotten into, secondary materials and so on, is that this film actually takes place only 4 months after the events of Guardians 1.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty quick. Yeah, like I just once I got into the movie, I was like, man, they put a lot of depth, like emotional character development depth into so many of the characters, like Ego, Yondu, Peter Quill himself, Gamora and Nebula, and even Rocket got like some character depth to him.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was worried at the beginning that I would be sort of that this movie had a little bit succumbed to the whole comedy sequel problem, where like it's really easy to make sequels to action movies, like decent sequels, but it's really rare to have a sequel to a comedy that's as good or better than the first one. Like I can't think of any.
Sure, that makes sense.
And because this is kind of a comedy / action movie, it might have suffered. At least I feel like at the beginning it might have suffered from the same thing, where it's like they're just a little too unsubtle with like, this is the type of humor that Guardians 1 had, and now we're going to do it more and harder, like. And it seemed like that maybe a little bit, but by the end I feel like there was enough depth of emotion and plot to overcome that.
Yeah.
So good job, guys who made the movie.
Well, and honestly, I really liked a lot of the humor, even right from the get-go.
I'm not saying bad humor. It was definitely good humor, but like there's the critic part of me that I have a love-hate relationship with.
Right.
That I like sometimes, that I sort of hate, that I go down this train of thought sometimes, but like the critic part of me is going, okay, you're trying really hard, But it was still funny. Like I have a list